next speaker is Kelly Gough, our current chair of the Australian Psychological Society College of Clinical Neuropsychologists. Kelly is a clinical psychologist and clinical neuropsychologist with nearly 20 years of experience across a range of settings and was previously a state chair of the CCN. Please join me in welcoming Kelly to the stage for his chair address.
It's wonderful to see so many people here today. I saw many of you last night, and many of you probably saw me. I think I was wise to leave at the time that I did. It sounds like it all kind of kept kicking on, but I can tell you that I still feel somewhat hungover. So let's see how we go. Right, I haven't worked out how to use any of the buttons yet. So I was unsure what I was going to talk about when I was offered the opportunity to talk here. And so I thought that it would be interesting, because it was something I didn't know very much about, to look at the history of neuropsychology in Australia. I was trained in Western Australia, where I live and still work, and it was never really addressed in our training at all. I think on the East Coast you've got a longer tradition, and so maybe some of this stuff is probably more known to you. So we'll start at the past, we'll move forward to sort of where we've got to today, and then at the end I'm really interested in what you guys can tell me in terms of where we need to go in the future and what kind of areas we need to focus on as a profession. So for all the neuros out there, I expect feedback, and for everyone who isn't a neuro, I'd still be fascinated to hear what you guys would like us to do as well. So, a brief overview. It is a potted history. It is no way thorough, and I am in no way a historian, and I only have 45 minutes, so we're just going to touch on some of the main points, I think, about the past. I've gathered this from the very few references that I could find. There's not a huge amount of information out there. There's a few articles that people have written. I've talked to a number of my colleagues, some of them more senior in years than me, and I've got some good ideas and some good stories from them. And some of it really is just my own musings and opinions, and so you're happy to just discard them wherever you might want. So we'll start at the beginning. We'll look at how we've grown as a profession and consider what comes next. For those who have met me, you'll know that I tend to waffle on, and I can be easily tangential. So if at any point I do become Grandpa Simpson, just sort of wave at me, give me a poke, and I'll try and reorient myself as best I can. So in Australia's love affair with neuropsychology begins very much in research. Long before we actually had any training programs, there was interesting research happening in neuropsychology. And I think that's fitting because we still have an amazing research programs going on in Australia, and we'll talk a bit about them later on as well. So the first character that we meet is Stanley Porteous. Is that a name that's familiar? Is anyone? Yeah, it's a few nods. So Stanley, initially he was a school teacher, and he worked in the Victorian mountains. He had one of those one-room classrooms with lots of different students from different years together. And Stanley was quite interested in what it was that made a student better at being a student, what made them more effective, and also what kind of led them to having problems, what we would probably call learning disorders these days. So he began sort of reading information on that, trying to do some stuff with his students, and then he was very happy to find out that this the job at the Bell Street Special School for the mentally deficient in Fitzroy. I don't think it was in Fitzroy for any particular reason, so if you come from Fitzroy, don't take that personally. But he got that job, and he moved down from Melbourne, moved down from the hills to Melbourne and took that, and then ultimately became appointed as a psychologist at the Melbourne Teachers Training College. I say psychologist in inverted commas because there wasn't really training programs for it, and he was in no way trained as a psychologist, but back in those days, I guess it wasn't a protected title, so you could just go for it. So the Teachers Training College was linked to the University of Melbourne, and Porteous and his interests in intelligence, he became friends with Richard Berry, who was the chair of anatomy at Melbourne Uni back then. Berry had already been conducting extensive research trying to work out if he could predict who was going to turn into a criminal or be otherwise mentally deficient by measuring heads. And so he'd been measuring quite a lot of heads across various different populations. Stanley thought that sounded like an interesting idea, and the two of them got together and they measured the heads of many thousands of school children. They carefully measured their skulls, and the assumption obviously was that small brains would equal social misfits as adults. Berry had a lot of work looking at racial differences in cranial capacity, and he was pretty sure, obviously, that different races would have different sized heads, and the whole thing would relink together. He was quite popular at the time. The local media proprietors seemed to have a lot of time for Berry. I guess that says something about media proprietors and maybe how they haven't changed that much. It's pretty easy. I think we can all guess, what his findings led to. So if you're thinking, Richard Berry, I've heard that name, but I wasn't alive 100 years ago, what was he about? Well, you might remember him from 2017. In 2017, there was a bit of an outcry because a lot of Berry's work had been talked about again. A lot of students were kind of upset about the fact. Berry was a eugenicist. He made comments like, if we could just get rid of 25% of the population, everyone would be much better off. And obviously it's a certain 25% of the population he wanted to get rid of. He was also quite racist in a lot of the things that he said. And then this is Berry, by the way. He looks very much like a 1920s style, master criminal, doesn't he? He went on to say a lot of these racist things, and it was found, as an anatomy professor, he had a large collection of body parts. He, in that collection, had a lot of Indigenous skulls. It was unclear kind of where he got them from or whether he should have had them. All of this kind of came to a head, and in 2017 he was cancelled. His name was removed from one of the halls at Melbourne Uni, and there was a bit of a public scandal about it. So Porteous, he wasn't happy with just measuring heads. He was more of a scientific man in some ways than that, and before any of the head measuring was happening, he was already starting to use the Binet IQ test, which was before it became the Stanford Binet, and he was using that to try and understand the intelligence of the students that he had, and trying to sort of work out which ones he'd put in different kinds of levels of training in his school. So he found that the Binet, while it was good, it seemed to lack something for him. It didn't seem to translate very well into the day-to-day of these children. And so he ended up developing his own task. And if anyone remembers Porteous, it's probably because of his maze task, which is still available today. You can go out and buy the latest version of it. I haven't checked, but I assume Pearson probably sells it. How it worked, essentially, was that you would have these mazes. They'd start from quite simple ones. They'd move up to complex ones. There was a time period in which you had to try and do as many of them as you could. You lost points for taking your pencil off the page, and every time you went down a dead end, or if you had to backtrack. And out of all of this, they get an overall score. He thought it was a really good test of overall intelligence, and of planning and foresight and sort of social reasoning, and it is actually quite a good test. It isn't really a great test of overall IQ, but it's not terrible. What it is actually probably a better test of is frontal lobe function, or what we call executive functions these days, and it is quite sensitive to that, and continues to be used in those sorts of areas. So for a planning task, for an understanding of organisation and sort of spatial awareness, it's quite good. Porteous, he thought of it as a culture fair test, which I'm sure you've all heard that term applied to various assessment instruments that we have. So he thought it was culture fair because, just look at it. There's a mouse on one side, and there's a bit of cheese on the other, and there's a maze in the middle. Everybody knows what a mouse is and a cheese, and everyone understands mazes, certainly. Everyone sat down at a table and uses a pen regularly. Clearly, everyone in the entire world could understand this task. And also, because it's so straightforward, you barely need any sort of English language skills to be able to explain to the person what they need to do. So he thought it was culture fair. After he finished his work in Australia, he moved on to get a job in the US, and he went through a few different roles over there. He was involved in doing assessments using his culture fair test across a range of different people, and he kind of got back into the racial stuff again, and tried to work out, which races were smarter than others. I think he was initially coming from a good place, but ultimately he gets data along the way that doesn't really fit with his assumptions. He gets data from, I think it was in the Kimberley, there's a school that was all Indigenous children, and there was another school nearby that was all white children. The Indigenous children did better. He found ways to hand wave that away. He did some work in South Africa with some tribes. One of the tribes had a game that they used to play regularly. It was like a labyrinth kind of game. That tribe did very well on the test. Another tribe that would have to be genetically very similar, not very far away, did not play that game. They did not do well. So we can all look at that sort of stuff and go, well, clearly there's something else going on here, right? It must be measuring something other than just like this culture fair intelligence. But he sort of moved past that and kind of hand waved it away. Ultimately, somewhere in the 90s, Stanley also got cancelled when the students at the University of Hawaii decided that he really just was more racist than they accepted, and his name got taken off of a hall. The maze continues. It's still out there today. It was in the WISC for the first 3 versions of it, so it's a good task. So I thought I'd talk about those guys because there's some lessons that we can take away from it all. And I think the first one is this idea of culture fair. What is a culture fair task? Can the culture fair task ever really exist? How do you know what another person's culture implicitly teaches them about the world? How can they know what yours is, right? We're always going to have blind spots, and it's almost impossible to be able to see those blind spots because we're not even really aware of what we have in our version of the world that is different to theirs. I would have thought, previous to coming to this conference, that something like processing speed, right? That's got to be a pretty culture fair kind of thing, the coding and the. But I was in the assessment stream, so anyone who didn't see it, by all means go back. Matt Stales produced a wonderful piece of data showing the difference between, say, Japanese people and Greek people on those processing speed tasks, where there's like more than 1.5 standard deviations between them. Some of it might have been about education and quality of education and stuff, but that doesn't explain all of it. So, really fascinating. These things that we take for granted maybe aren't as obvious as I think. And that leads into this idea of gender and preconception can blind us. We will often go into these sorts of assessments or these sorts of research with an idea about what we're expecting to find, because that's been transmitted to us by our own culture and our own understanding of the world. We have to be open, obviously, to seeing that that's wrong, but that can be quite difficult sometimes for people. I remember an old lecturer of mine used to describe it as, if you're a good scientist, if your hypothesis is that all swans are white, then your job as a scientist is to go out and try and find a black swan. Don't go out looking for white swans. Your job is to find a black one. Stanley found black swans, and he decided that maybe they were just white swans that got a bit dirty. So you have to be open to these ideas when they come along. And then that kind of leads to this idea of doing to versus doing with. If we're going to try and understand another cultural group, if we're going to try and understand how they see the world and therefore how we could maybe turn that into an assessment, we can't do that for them, and they can't do it for themselves. We have to do it together. We have to both be able to kind of sit down and help each other understand what this world looks like through their eyes, and we have to then help them understand what it is that we're even trying to assess, because some of these ideas might be entirely foreign to their culture. So we then kind of jump forward quite a few decades to when university training in psychology begins. I say university training. There were programs before this, and there's some really good ones in UQ and in other parts of Australia. We're going to be talking about Melbourne Uni because they were the first postgraduate courses that were really designed to try and fit in with the then newly minted APS's ideas about what a clinical psychologist should know. So 1972 was the first intake of their 2-year master's program in clinical psych. And it was aligned, as I said, with the APS had just broken away from the British Psychological Society just a few years before that, and they'd come up with their sort of criteria and training ideas about what a clinical psychologist should know. So this was the first program built around that. Around that time, the university was also building a lot of stronger connections with the hospitals in the area, and they were looking to build research programs that would bridge between, psychology and medicine and other disciplines as well. And the Austin Hospital was the one of the big ones that's important in our story that the university was building ties with. I tried to find online the Austin Hospital's little logo and insignia there. That's the only one I could find. A shot glass. I don't know what that says about that time, but it seems weird that and I had a good look. I really did. So the story of how sort of the program develops is sort of based around these lunches that happened on Lygon Street back in the 70s. Bob Priestley was the Associate Dean of Arts, and he worked in the Student Services program. He had a degree in medical psychology from the University of Queensland, and he was the first one to suggest that maybe the psychology students at the University of Melbourne, they should learn neuroanatomy. Neuroanatomy is an important thing, and so he ended up getting Jeff Kenny, who was another anatomist at Melbourne Uni, to come and start teaching like an undergrad neuroanatomical dissection elective. And it was some years after that there was funding suddenly in the university, this new development grant, because the uni was getting less money from the government, and they were trying to find other ways to sort of build up their programs. And so Bob got together with Jeff and Gordon Stanley, who was another one of the lecturers there, and they talked about, well, maybe it's time that we actually tried to get a neuropsychological program going as well. At this point, they had some neuropsych sort of undergrad electives happening with a man that we'll talk about more in a moment, and so they put forward this proposal to the grant for the creation of this postgraduate research and clinical training program, looking at the assessment and management of problems associated with cerebral impairments and physical handicaps in children and adults. They proposed a 2-year course with a 60-40 split between coursework and a clinical research topic. They put all of this in, they crossed their fingers, and lo and behold, it was approved. And so then they had to work out what they were going to do about it in terms of who was going to be the staff. And so they kept Jeff Kenny, and they also tapped on the shoulder a man who probably needs no introduction, Kevin Walsh. I never heard of Kevin in my training. I never heard of him or any of the history of this until much later on when I started to come to conferences. So it's quite surprising that even in a country like Australia, we can have quite a split between our understanding of our own discipline. So briefly, for those who don't know, Kevin was a medical doctor first. He completed his medical degree in 1951, and through the 1950s he worked in neuropsychiatric services and was involved in a lot of frontal luectomies, which probably everyone knows better as lobotomies. That's the device, or one of them, that goes in there and then sort of swings around and all your cares go away. Kevin was actually quite interested in what happened to people after they had lobotomies. He was fascinated by the changes that you saw in these people, and he wanted to find a better way to understand that, and that led him to ultimately go back to university and do a master's in psychology. And as part of that master's, he used the Porteous-Mays task, which was actually a very good choice because it's very sensitive to those frontal regions. He submitted his thesis in 1960. In 1961, he joined the University of Melbourne Psychology Department. He taught an undergrad course in biological psychology first, and then through his very strong connections with the Austin Hospital, that then led to a connection and a neuropsychology clinic starting there. Kevin worked with his friend, the neurologist Peter Bladden. They worked a lot with epilepsy and stroke patients in the early years. And around that time, Kevin then began teaching his undergrad neuropsych elective and began to sort of collect a lot of material that he was putting together, which then ultimately became his book, which I think is in its 5th edition now. So that is the first class of neuropsychology cohort and staff. There's Kevin in the front row there. There's one other person in this picture who I believe might be here today. Jenny, she out there, yes. I don't know how many others are still working. I think it's probably just you, isn't it? Yeah, you just won't give up. I have to drag you out of here. So it's interesting that we started from such a small number of people. So apart from the work in training people, Kevin, Gordon and Peter went on to form the first brain impairment workshops that they held at the Austin in 1976. They thought it wouldn't be very many people, 30 or 40 will turn up. They picked a room for it. They got well over 100 people quite early on, and they had to sort of rush around and try and find a better place to put everyone. There was a lot of interest in this area from the beginning, and I think that's really nice to remember that though there's not ever been very many neuropsychologists, I think a lot of people really like the idea of it. A lot of people find it fascinating and they want to be involved and they want to come along to whatever training and things we put on. So ASSBI was officially founded in 1978 and Kevin was its first president. Some years later, the APS caught up and the College of Clinical Neuropsychologists began, I think in 1983, it might have been 1984. It's one of those things that's lost to the history of time. Nobody really knows, but it was about there. And Alan Tucker was our founding chair. And the focus, much like the focus of the clinical college at the time, was very much about rigorous evidence-based research and practice, and probably a little bit more on the research than it was on the practice. The CCN have had conferences almost every year since then. The first one started a bit late and we've missed a couple of conferences along the way, but almost every year. They're very popular. The CCN as a group, and I don't know whether this is neuropsychologists as well, we're a friendly bunch and we like to party. And so most of the conferences are friendly and engaging, and if you want to meet people, it's a good way to go. The first one was at the Manly Quarantine Station. You can see a picture of the main hall there. I was told by someone who was there that the walls were thin and the doors didn't close properly, and so you could hear everything. I don't know exactly what they meant by that, but clearly the world of neuropsychology was much smaller and closer back then than it is now. So in 1978, at that first brain impairment workshop, Kevin closed with these words, "May I hope that if it does nothing else, this conference will produce dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction about what we are doing for the brain-impaired child and adult, dissatisfaction for the lack of training we're giving to those concerned with their management, dissatisfaction will lead us to meetings that will allow us to tackle specific problems in the future with some measure of success." And I thought that was important to think about, because the rest of this is going to be about, well, how have we done? So, the current state of neuropsychology in Australia. Well, from those first 6 graduates in 1980, we now have 974 neuropsychologists working in 2025. And we've gone from 1 training program to around about 6. It's a bit up in the air at the moment, but it sounds like there's some new stuff about to appear. But we're still pretty rare if you compare us with other psychologists, where we make up 5.7% of all the endorsed psychologists, which is quite tiny. But if you compare us with all of the generally registered psychologists as well, it's less than 3%. We are diamonds in the rough. I've also heard that there's at least 3 Indigenous students in programs now as well this year, so that's really good. I think that's a great step forward. So the location of the training programs matches very much with the density of the clinicians. So we can see Victoria has 440, and they've had the longest running training programs. New South Wales at 228. Queensland then coming in at 153. WA 71. That's the end of the states that have training programs. And then all the other ones, we've got South Australia at 37. We've got the ACT at 14. We've got Tasmania at 9. And just in there, the Northern Territory at 5. So you can see that we're not very well distributed. There's clearly a problem if you live in one of those states that is the tiny sliver that you can barely see at the top. There are barriers to training neuropsychologists and psychologists in general. The problem generally is the growth of our profession is constrained very much not by the demand on the profession, but by the infrastructure that is required to train people. You need to have programs, but you also need to have places for those students to go on prac, and if you don't have places for them to go on prac, then you can't run the programs, and then it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. So there are definitely fewer courses at the moment that meet demand. A lot of people have told me they're a really popular choice among students. A lot of good students apply that can't get in because they just don't have placements for them or places in the course for them. The practicums and the supervision is really challenging. Some universities just give up because it's too hard. Other people have told me that sometimes they feel like they're competing for the same placements as the clinical psych programs, and so they often sort of just disappear in the mix in those as well. The other things are the bigger, broader problems for just all psychology training, and this comes from the Division of Early Career in the APS did a survey of its members a few years back, well, actually probably about a year back now, and looked at the kinds of problems that they encountered at their beginning in their training and both in their early years. Placement poverty is a huge issue. There's problems with the unpaid placements, which is even more difficult if you have a job and you're normally trying to live on the income from that, and you've got to drop that to go and do a placement. Master's program fees are a problem. There's none of the paid placement schemes that was really sad that the government brought in for many other allied health. And supervision, once you do get out, is often self-funded and can be very expensive for a person who's just beginning in their career. The other one is all these barriers to access and inclusion. The training is often quite inaccessible if you're in a rural area, if you come from a lower SES background and therefore are more likely to need to work, if you have disabilities, if you are a caregiver for elderly parents. All these sorts of things can make it very difficult to engage in a normal program that expects you to be on campus, between these hours and going off and doing these full-time placements. And a lot of people really struggle with that. They find it too rigid, and it sort of blocks the capable students sometimes from progressing. And then the other one, I think, which is a really disturbing one, is this whole idea of psychological safety. There's a lot of reports of bullying, unsafe placements, people feeling overworked, burnt out. Universities often seem to fail to accommodate a lot of those needs and often don't do very much for placement grievances at all. There's stories where maybe if placement starts to go wrong, they'll just pull the student out of it and put them somewhere else, but they often don't actually do anything about the problematic supervisor. So these are issues across not just us, it's all different parts of psychology. There's also concerns that there's too much theory in the undergrad and there's no real practical skills. So a lot of people feel like they don't really understand what it is to be a psychologist until they hit their master's programs, and then maybe that wasn't what they wanted. There's a lot of worry about the two-tier system and what that means about the loss of diversity in our profession. And there's a lot of reports about really exploitative and unsafe internships for people in the 5+1 programs where they're being worked like dogs in some of these practices and being expected to do a huge amount of work for very little money. So about 1 in 4 early career psychologists consider leaving quite seriously. So if you are an early career psychologist out there and you have thought about leaving, you're not alone. By all accounts, it gets better if you can stay. If you get through those first 2 to 3 years, things seem to pick up quite a lot. But I mean, that's not good enough, is it? Really, just to go oh well, hang in there. I think that's something that we really need to do something about. So where do we work? Well, we work across a wide range of locations, but really most of us work in a couple. Almost everyone works in hospitals, almost everyone works outside of that in private practice. Then below that there's some universities, dementia clinics, NGOs, a bit more in justice these days, but not a huge amount. So mostly, again, we're in these small areas. And that makes it, again, hard for people to get access to our services. There's other tensions in the profession at the moment between sort of the divide between the testers and the ones who really enjoy assessment and those who want to provide more sort of therapeutic input and more intervention programs. There's confusion and disagreement in some areas about what neuropsychologists can uniquely contribute, both outside of our profession but also within. I had some really interesting discussions with people about this and some very strongly held beliefs. I think a lot of students and a lot of clinicians really like the idea of intervention, right? They like the idea of being able to assess someone and then use that assessment to translate it into something useful for the person to help them day to day. And many people because, we're people who like people, we'd like to keep going with that assessment and the intervention program. We'd like to be involved and see how it turns out. Not everyone feels that way, and there are barriers to that as well, because a lot of the jobs in the hospitals are very much designed around us being diagnosticians and nothing else. They can pay someone less money to go and do the intervention. They can't pay that other person to do the assessment, so they just, it's assessment, and it becomes this kind of revolving door or a production line that a lot of people don't find very, very satisfying. Some people fear that it blurs our skills. Assessment is the one thing we do better than everyone else, so that's our product, that's the thing that we should sell. Is there really a unique product that we can sell in terms of a therapy or an intervention? I don't know. I think we bring something to it that maybe other psychologists don't, but I can see the argument that we could probably train other people to do those interventions adequately. So then there's an in-between line of do we just want to be the ones who are organising and sort of designing the intervention and then handing it over? I don't know. Others worry very much, though, that if we align too strongly with assessment, we limit our relevance in the future, and ultimately people just aren't interested in joining the profession. I think it's heading more towards the intervention, which I think is a good thing. Service access and equity, undersupply and maldistribution. There was a poster that I had a look at. Is Jesse out there somewhere? There he is. Go and talk to that man if you want to hear more about this. But he had a wonderful poster that had all of Australia on it, and it looked at the number of hours of neuropsychological services that have been performed in the last period. Almost all of it's grey, and then there's all the little urban areas are coloured, and then a few sort of outer-lying suburbs have got a little bit of colour, and there's a tiny bit of colour in the Northern Territory, and then nothing. So for the majority of Australia, there was no neuropsychological work done in that period. We are very, very centralised, the few of us that exist, into these urban centres, and there is almost nothing outside of that, which again is a problem that we need to do something about. The cultural issues, we don't really have good, valid assessment techniques for Indigenous people and for a lot of the multicultural groups in our society. Some of them it would be very difficult to develop those sorts of tools as well, so how are we going to manage that? What are we going to do about it? And as I said, culture fair tests really aren't. Medicare is another big one. We're basically unsubsidised. If you want to come and see someone outside of the hospital, or maybe if you were lucky enough to have a car accident, you're going to have to pay for it yourself, right? And so a lot of people just can't afford that. And it means a lot of vulnerable people who really could benefit from us never get to see us. So back in 2017, we had a go at getting on Medicare. It did not go well, and this is what they told us. So there was a lot of strong support in the community, the medical community, for the value of what we do, but the patient population was very broad. It was too hard to define, so the proposed service was not limited to a specific disease or medical condition, which is one of the things Medicare likes. The referrals weren't specific enough. They could potentially include everyone. The intervention was poorly defined. There were many different assessment tools, and there wasn't a single sort of benchmark to which ones you did with which kinds of problems. There was no high-quality evidence at assessing diagnostic performance of any condition affecting the brain. They thought there was no evidence that we were better at guiding treatment, no evidence for the impact of our services on changing in clinical management, no evidence that longer assessments were better than shorter ones, and due to the lack of all that high-quality evidence, they basically said, we're not interested. Things have moved on a lot since 2017. There's a lot more research that's been published since then. We have a lot more evidence on perceived value of assessment, but we have more evidence on the usefulness in rehabilitation planning. We've got evidence on the value of our differential diagnosis and treatment planning, particularly in dementia, which I think is an interesting area that we could push for first, because we have an ageing population and there's a lot of people who are going to be in that category soon, and we can add real value to those people. And there's evidence of incremental value now in a range of different disorders and diagnostic clarification. So, is it time? Is it time that we have another go? It's one of the questions we need to think about. I was going to talk more about research, but I think, if you've been at the conference, you've seen it. Australia, it does an amazing job. I think we punch far above our weight in terms of the kinds of quality research that we put out. We've got some fantastic stuff in rehab and assessment techniques, TBI, dementia, epilepsy, memory. The competencies work and the training work that we've been doing as well is fantastic and some of the best in the world. So I think, I don't need to really go into it in great detail. Look around you. Look at these people. It's amazing. So where do we go? What's going to happen with our future? How are we going to sort of manage this? I think we have to address cultural and linguistic needs. We need to do something about this in terms of developing more appropriate methods of assessment, especially for Indigenous Australians. And we need to understand the manifestations of disability as well. Like what one culture thinks of as a disability might not be the same as another one. So how do we even understand that? We need to have a lot of resources that go into this, and particularly, probably government resources to broaden service delivery and get people out there to these disadvantaged groups. The changes in the psych board's competencies, I think, are a really big step forward in a lot of this, and I think they've raised awareness to a point where people are now interested in going out and finding out more about these sorts of topics. So hopefully that's really going to kick things along, but it also needs a lot of that sort of government support and funding to go with it. And all of government responses always seem to be quite fragmented, so it's hard to know if we'll actually get that. Training needs to better prepare people for delivering these interventions. The majority of our students want to be able to do them, but a lot of clinicians in the working now as well also feel that they'd like to do them, but they don't have the confidence to. So we need to have better ways of practicing interventions during placements, which is quite difficult if those placements are in hospitals where the intervention is not performed by the neuropsychologist. We need continued efforts as well to develop more quality PD for existing clinicians to be able to access it so that they can build their skills and feel more confident either supervising a student who's going to do these interventions and also doing them themselves. And practicum poverty is a real issue and we need to do something about it. I think I'm horrified that one part of government was saying there's not enough psychologists, we need more psychologists, we need to pump them out. And then another arm of government right at the same time says, oh, we're going to deal with placement poverty, and they leave us out. Like, what is happening? How can these two people not be talking to each other? So I think that's a real issue and it's something that we need to push for. Professional recognition as well, is it time for that Medicare push? What are we going to do? How are we going to best achieve it? It would be bad if we tried and we failed. The other one is, of course, in private practice particularly, if you're, say, in a private practice where there's a clin psych and a neuropsych and you're both going to do the same intervention program, if the person comes through Medicare and they see the clin psych, they get $145 back every hour. If they see you, they get $95 back. That seems weird, doesn't it? Maybe it's a time that we start to look again at like the two-tier model. The APS put out a white paper some years back, which is by no means something that everybody at the APS supports, but they suggested that maybe the two-tier model could be based around people with an endorsement working in their field of practice would get the higher rate and everybody else, or if you weren't working in your field of practice, whatever, would get the lower rate. I mean, it's something. I don't know if it really makes sense entirely. I think the whole thing kind of needs to be readdressed. But, we need to do something about it. So maybe we need to, think about the elephant in the room. Our ageing population is going to require a lot more of our services as we go along, which is, great news for us. It's more money in the bank. But, we have to find ways to make it fair and equitable for those people to get to us. So how do we improve access to regional services? Do we put public funding in it? Are there training incentives to practice remotely? Are there just improvements to telehealth? There was a talk I went to, I can't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, that was saying that just giving people benefits to go and practice in the country doesn't work, that they tend to stay there briefly and then they leave. So what you actually need to do is try and recruit people who are rural into the programs, because rural people are more likely to go back and live rurally again. So we need to probably think more broadly about how we're going to do that sort of stuff. And then we've got these sort of emerging issues that probably weren't around before. We've got computerised test batteries that are starting to come up more and more these days. Some of them can be great. I think they can be really useful screening tools, but they lack a lot of cross-norming with other tests. Some of them have quite small samples. Hardware costs and availability can be an issue. There's often very little qualitative data that you get to come out of your test results. You don't really understand how the person got to those marks, on the scores. AI, wonderful and terrible. I've found it fantastic in aspects of my work, but it also has a lot of problems. There are some really good tools out there for helping you learn, what the literature's like. There's some great tools for note-taking. There's inaccuracies, there's some privacy concerns, which I think are quite reasonable. The UK is about to bring in new legislation now so that if you're using these things, they have to meet the requirements of a medical device, which obviously none of them do at the moment. So that's going to probably be an interesting thing to see how that plays out and whether our government does something similar. There's stories about the therapy note-taking services. Some of them are collecting all of that information and using those therapy sessions to train their therapy bots, who will then be providing therapy to people. So, it's it's pretty cutthroat. So I'm sure some of them are good, but it's another thing to think about. The other one is test security, and this is it's a global issue, but it's become more of a global issue now that it's so easy to scan things and put them online, and then everyone can see them forever. We did a survey recently, and about half of the neuropsychologists that we surveyed were receiving requests for test data monthly to quarterly, with about 80, almost 80% of them complying with the request, like always or often. So most of us are quite happy to send information out. Most commonly, those requests come from other neuropsychologists or other psychologists. So they're people, I guess, getting someone and wanting to do follow-up assessments, that kind of thing. But the next largest source is court subpoenas and lawyers asking for this information. They're not just asking for the report, they're asking for the whole file. They want to have the test protocols, they want to have everything. So what we found was about more than half of people really didn't know how to respond. They didn't feel confident in how they were going to respond to those sorts of things. That's probably something that we need to look at as well. How are we going to make all of us feel more confident in what we can say no to, and how is the best way to say no to those sorts of things? So, it's 50 years, give or take. Are we satisfied? Do we think we've made enough progress? What else do we need to do? We've got more neuros than we ever did, but they're still very centralised and it's very hard to get hold of them. We've got more training courses, and we are pushing against the tide. Like clinical is doing well. We're kind of kicking up there, and while other domains of psychology are dying, but there's still not very many of us, and there's still difficulties with getting jobs. There's all the ongoing changes with APAC and everything at the moment and what that might bring. Where should we focus our efforts? Ultimately, as the CCN chair, I am your advocate. I am here to try and promote the needs of our profession broadly. I invite your feedback. If you want to talk now, by all means. If you want to catch me after, the CCN's having a little lunch thing. So if you are a CCN member or you're, college curious and you'd like to come along, by all means, we'd love to chat with you over lunch as well. Thank you. Do I have questions? Oh, wonderful.
Thank you, Kelly. We have a few questions. Don't know which one to go with first. Okay. Regarding Medicare, is starting with trying to get funding for one cohort a way to start? And if successful, this model could then be used for other types of patients?
I think that is a good idea. I think that it would be easier, given the way Medicare works, to try and pick one specific disorder or one specific group. I think dementia is probably the way in at the moment, because it's an area of concern for the government and it's an area that we can demonstrate that we can really make a big difference in.
Okay, so there's a couple of related questions. What is the CCN doing to address the barriers to training, especially the safety and accessibility of the courses?
Directly, the CCN has a limited ability to do very much about that. So mostly what we're trying to do is educational and advocacy back to the APS. The APS does have some sway in these sorts of things, and I think that we just need to make sure that they're clear about what it is the members want them to do. It's a bigger issue than just for neuropsychology, so I think that it's probably something that is going to get addressed. But again, it's not something we can directly do much about.
This is a different kind of safety. So you mentioned in your talk psychological safety. What about the cultural safety of neuropsychology as a discipline? So that could be the way we practice as professionals, but also how we train our students.
Yeah, it's it's a very white profession. Like the majority, I think 80-something% of us are young white females. So we're not in any way diverse. I think that's going to come down to training courses. I think that it's really the only opportunity to make that sort of substantive change across the population of neuros in the future is going to be to really address those sorts of issues right at the beginning. And I suppose along the way, we can also try and develop training programs to help people at least begin to understand those blind spots that they have.
I just wanted to clarify, cultural safety is at the determination of the person experiencing the thing. So it's not for us to say whether it's culturally safe. But are there, do you have any concerns about the way we practice that could be harmful for cultural safety?
I'd have to hear it from them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think we need, but like I was saying at the beginning, we would need to have more of that two-way process. We can't do things for them for whatever these multicultural groups. We need them to work with us to explain. Yeah. Do
you think that the CCN could sort of look at prioritising diverse voices in amongst the CCN?
Yeah,
as a
certainly.
way to sort of do a top-down address of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's beyond even just the CCN, but the APS in general, I think, definitely.
Yeah, so the APS have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategy group, for example, that advise on those sorts of things.
Yeah. And we have our decolonising neuropsychology group.
Yeah, I'm non-Indigenous though.
I know.
So,
Yeah.
So how can we open our discipline up to be more safe for maybe those future Aboriginal students who might want to stick around and be neuroscience?
I don't know. I think it's something that I'm open to find out more about.
Yeah. And, okay, so a little bit tangential but related. As a profession, how can we support the early career psychologists and neuropsychs to stay in the profession?
I think the best thing that we can possibly do with that is maybe better training and better support for supervisors, for both supervisors on pracs but also supervisors who are doing those sort of first 2 years of their training. They're part of that problem. They're not the whole problem, but it seems to be the quality of supervision and the quality of that connection is one of the things that people really... It's not the biggest problem necessarily, but it's the biggest problem to deal with. A lot of young people feel that they can't complain, right? They just sort of put up with it because they're worried that if they do make a complaint, maybe their career is going to suffer as much as the other person's. So I think we need to find ways to maybe improve that.
Responding to legal requests, should this be the role of CCN to publish a position and recommendation that can instill consistency in practitioners and be shared with legal firms making these requests?
Yes, it is, and we are. So at the moment there's a test security working group that's between ourselves, ACNA at the moment, and we hope to expand that out to the other colleges like the Ed and Dev College, the Clinical College, ACPA as well. Ideally, we'd like to have as many people as we can behind the same sort of statement, which we can then get to the courts and get to the judges so that they understand. A lot of it's really just, I think, a misunderstanding of what they're asking for. It's not that they really need this material and they don't really understand the problems of this material getting leaked. And so I think it's more of an education campaign than anything else. So, watch this space. We're trying to work at it at the moment.
There's a whole lot of other questions that are just coming in right now.
Yeah, come and find me.
We've got a couple more minutes, so are you happy to
sure.
ask? Yeah. So the placement shortage issue is common to other health professional disciplines. What have been met by diversifying placements and innovation solutions? Do you think there is scope for psych to follow a similar trajectory to support future placements?
Maybe. I don't know. Whoever asked me that question will have to tell me exactly what they mean. But I think the biggest problem that we tend to have is finding enough supervisors. The government put some money into that recently, so we do have more out there now. So there's more private practice supervision and stuff happening. But it's difficult because we can't really, whoever or wherever you go, you have to have a psychologist with your endorsement as the primary supervisor. you can have other stuff happen, and I've heard of some really good placements over the years where, you know, the student has also been part of a multidisciplinary team, and they've done stuff with the OTs, they've done stuff with the speechies, and that stuff's fantastic. And so maybe more of those sorts of programs could be promoted as well.
And perhaps this is the last question. As an early career psychologist, how can we advocate for our spot in different institutions? For example, finding pockets where we have a role where there might be previously a clin psych in that position.
I think it's about education again. It's about trying to really be clear and understand what it is that you can offer, and how you're going to make that particular place work more effectively, or how you're going to make that place be more efficient financially, and being able to communicate that to the management of the place. If you've got enough information, great. If you need more information, by all means reach out to the CCN, talk to your fellow neuropsychologists. Other people might have been in a similar situation to you in some other hospital somewhere, and they might have some good ideas. There's online forums you can use to reach out. There's NP in Oz as well. I think really don't feel like you have to kind of reinvent the wheel. By all means, try and find out what other people have done before you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Kelly.
you.